Okay, hello there, folks. Mrs. Gotham here. Really nice to be talking to you today about the next of your poems for Power and Conflict Poetry. And today we are looking at the poem Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes, which was written in 1957. So, a bit of context about the poem before we get into the poem proper. So, the poem is set in the First World War, which hopefully you know a little bit about from some of your history lessons, but it was written nearly 40 years later. So, unlike Exposure, that was actually written by somebody who fought in the First World War, Hughes didn't himself fight in the First World War, but his father did. So, it's likely that he would have heard some of his father's experiences and stories after the event. But it's important to remember that this is not a poem that was written by a First World War poet. The title of the poem, Bayonet Charge, refers to a bayonet, which is a knife or sword fixed to the end of a rifle, which is a gun. So it can be used as a spear, and it required soldiers to get very close to the enemy in order to be effective. And it looked a bit like this. So you can see the rifle here and then the bayonet on the end, which would have been used to stab the enemy. So the soldier in this poem carries one of these whilst he is running towards the enemy. So let's have a look at actually what happens in the poem. So the poem shows the thoughts and feelings of one soldier. So it doesn't focus on lots of soldiers as Exposure does, but just one. And in this poem, he's charging towards the enemy, holding out his bayonet rifle. Now, it doesn't tell us this, but we can assume this might be somewhere like no man's land in between the trenches, as he is kind of charging forward and can't really see where he's going. So the battlefield seems quite chaotic and quite confusing. There's lots of rifle fire, which would have led to quite a lot of smoke. And so the soldier doesn't really know where he's going, what direction he's going in, where he's supposed to be facing, where his enemy are. So at first, at the beginning of the poem, the soldier feels quite patriotic. So patriotic is when you're proud of doing things for your country. So he feels like he's doing his duty at the beginning of the poem. But as the poem goes on, he starts to question this and wonder if this is the right thing that he's doing. He feels like he's quite a small part in the huge machine of war, which is running without his control. He can't affect his own future. And at this point in the poem, he sees a hare, which is a large rabbit, and the hare is running away from the battlefield. So this image shows that both he and the hare are kind of trapped in this battle. Neither of them really have a choice about being there. And the hare is killed in the poem in a very painful way. So perhaps this is showing us that the soldier himself might also meet such a miserable end. And the poem ends by him talking about the fact that before he got to the front line of the battle, he wanted to fight for his king and his country, and he saw that this was a really important thing. But suddenly these things don't seem to matter to him anymore. His terror completely takes over at the end of the poem. So next I will read you the poem. So Bayonet Charge by Ted Hughes. Suddenly he awoke and was running, raw. In raw seamed hot khaki, his sweat heavy, stumbling across a field of clods towards a green hedge that dazzled with rifle fire, hearing bullets smacking the belly out of the air. He lugged a rifle, numb as a smashed arm, the patriotic tear that had brimmed in his eye, sweating like molten iron from the centre of his chest. In bewilderment, then, he almost stopped. In what cold clockwork of the stars and the nations was he the hand pointing that second? He was running like a man who had jumped up in the dark and runs listening between his footfalls for the reason of his still running, and his foot hung like statuary in mid-stride. Then the shot slashed furrows, threw up a yellow hair that rolled like a flame, and crawled in a threshing circle, its mouth wide, open, silent, its eyes standing out. He plunged past with his bayonet towards the green hedge. King, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries in a yelling alarm. To get out of that blue, crackling air, his terror's touchy dynamite. Alright, so some of the themes of this poem then. So we've got two major themes shown in this poem. First of all is the reality of conflict. So this poem shows us really quite clearly that conflict is a violent thing. It's not a pleasant place to be. In fact, it's terrifying and quite chaotic. It's not really clear what's going on or who's battling who in the height of the battle. And this all leads to the fact that patriotic ideals, this idea of fighting for your country, often get lost in the horror of war, and actually it's staying alive that becomes your only concern. And the second key theme is the effect that conflict can have on the people who are fighting. So in this poem, conflict very much leads to a feeling of futility and a sense of pointlessness. And you can see at the bottom, that means that it no longer feels like there's any point or purpose to the fighting. It becomes like it's a pointless task. So it might be worth making some notes from the slides that have come so far. So make sure you've got some notes written down either in your booklet or on the poem or on a sheet of paper about the context of the poem, about what happens in the poem, and then about some of the key themes. So you've got a chance to rewind the video now to make some notes on the slides that have come so far. All right, folks, hopefully you've made some notes on what we've had so far. So we're going to get into the key quotes now. So again, what I'd suggest with these is that you're either making notes on them on the poem if you've been able to print it or you have it printed, or if not, that you write the quote down and make some notes. I'm going to give you some bullet points about each quote, and what I suggest you do is pause after each bullet point, think it through. What does that mean to you, and can you write it down in notes, but in your own words, rather than just copying down my words from the screen? So first quote we've got here is the very first line of the poem. Suddenly he awoke and was running raw. So first of all, this quote creates a sense of immediate panic. We're thrown right into the action at the beginning of this poem. And this is shown by the adverb suddenly, which shows us that the action on the battlefield happened without warning and that the soldier was unprepared. And in fact, this is kind of reinforced by the fact that it says he awoke. So to suggest to us that he's just woken up and has straight away been thrown into the battle. So he's lacking control. It wasn't him who decided that they were suddenly going to fight, but probably someone else, like a general, telling him that he had to get up and go. And this is again supported by the adjective raw. So if you rub something raw, it means that it's very painful, but it's also quite exposed. And this kind of shows in the poem here that he's lacking protection. So he doesn't have warning, he doesn't have time to prepare, perhaps he doesn't even have proper training. Remember that a lot of soldiers in World War I were very young and also got sent out to the front quite quickly without really having the skills to be able to fight. So this adjective raw here shows how exposed and vulnerable this soldier is in this situation. And if you want to build on this idea, raw is also repeated on the second line of the poem to further emphasise that. So this is clearly an adjective that Hughes really wants to draw our attention to. So overall, what does this show us then about the reality of war and conflict? It shows us that man's power doesn't last forever. And actually, it eventually becomes insignificant over time, so no longer important. And that actually time and nature are far more powerful than man. Man doesn't really have much control over what's going on around him. All right, on to key quote 2. If you want to spend some more time on key quote 1, you're welcome to pause here and rewind the video to make sure that you've got proper notes on key quote 1 before moving on. So key quote 2 we've got here is bullets smacking the belly out of the air. A great line. We've got some really violent imagery here in this quote. It's really trying to make us picture how the bullets are flying across this battlefield, and also that they're hitting soldiers, they're hitting them in their belly. And here this quote is very much to do with sound. So you've got several things with sound going on here. You've got the onomatopoeia, first of all, with the verb smacking. But you've also got alliteration with bullets and belly as well. And those are actually plosive alliterative sounds when you have B, alliteration with the sound B, to kind of further reinforce the hitting and the smacking. So all of this is really showing the effects of the sound and the impact that the bullets would make. And the verb smacking is also quite aggressive and punishing. It has connotations when we talk about smacking someone of hurting them in quite an aggressive way. So it's interesting here that Hughes has chosen to use the verb smacking to connote that. And then a little bit of a structure point here. So it's important to note that this line is an example of enjambment. So a quick reminder, enjambment is when the sentences of the poem run over multiple lines. So rather than stopping at the end of the line, they carry on to the next line. And this poem is full of enjambment. It's actually almost on every line of the poem. So generally when we have enjambment, it always sort of shows a lack of control or confusion. And here it's doing exactly that as well. It's reinforcing the chaos, the confusion, the speed of the battle. So that's why lots of lines in the poem have examples of enjambment here. And this is an example of one of them. And then overall, what does this quote show us then? What can we actually say here to do with conflict and the reality and the effects of conflict? So we can say that conflict is violent, it's graphic, and it's chaotic. Is quite purely what we can say from this quote. All right, on to key quote number 3. So key quote number 3 is, in bewilderment then, he almost stopped. So this is quite a key quote in this poem for several reasons. So first of all, we start off with the noun bewilderment. So when you're bewildered, it means you can't really comprehend or understand what's going on around you. You're overwhelmed by it, you're very confused by it. So the man here, the soldier here, really can't rationally understand the situation. He's in such a chaotic situation that he can't deal with it. And if you want to extend this point further, this idea was actually first implied way back in stanza 1 of the poem, with the verb stumbling and the adjective dazzled, which all create a semantic field of confusion. So we've kind of got this running thread of it being chaotic and confusing all the way through the poem, but this is also reflective of that in this quote. And this chaos and confusion that he's feeling actually makes him almost stop completely as he runs. So obviously this would have been quite deadly, most likely because if he was a still target, it would have made it much easier for the enemy to have shot him. So the fact that he's stopping in the middle of the battle is quite a big action to take. And then in contrast to the previous quote, this is actually one of the only lines in the poem that is an end stop line. So the dash at the end of this line makes it an end stop. And it's one of the reasons it's probably an end stop line is because it's also the volta of the poem. So you may well have remembered volta from some of the other poems you've looked at, specifically Remains. So volta is the turning point of the poem, when things kind of turn on their head. So this is the turning point or the volta of this poem because it pauses the action. Up until this point, it's been a very fast-paced, chaotic poem. And here we have he stops and we as a reader also have to stop. And that's because kind of nothing makes sense anymore at this point. The things that he thought he believed in before no longer make sense. So what does this show us then about reality of conflict or the effect of conflict? It shows us that conflict creates a sense of pointlessness and a feeling of futility and chaos. So he kind of realises at this point in the poem that there's no point anymore to the fighting. Why is he carrying on with it in the middle of this battle? And key quote 4, which is our final kind of main quote, is the final line of the poem. And in this poem, it's his terror's touchy dynamite. So this kind of gives us an image or a picture of the soldier and shows that he's driven by absolute pure terror at the end of this poem. And this pure terror means that he could metaphorically explode at any moment, just because he's so afraid. And that's emphasised by the alliteration here of terror and touchy. And obviously there isn't kind of real dynamite in this quote, but actually the terror itself, or his terror itself, is the dynamite, or is being compared to it. So that's why we can say that this quote is a metaphor. And it almost suggests that he's become the weapon. Rather than a human being, he is the one that's being sent out to attack others. And this sort of shows us as well that war can be really dehumanizing. It can take away the things that make us human beings and the things that make our identities important. And I think this was probably a common problem with soldiers in World War One. They all sort of felt like they were part of this mass attack, kind of part of the machinery of war, and had no control over it really themselves. And again, this line is an end stop at the end of the poem, again suggesting that he might die, possibly. As I said earlier, the image of the hare and his death suggests that too. So although it doesn't say that at the end of the poem that he dies, we can guess that might be the case. And all that he's left with at the end of this poem is fear. So the patriotism and the honour of war and everything positive really has fallen away at this point. So what does this show us overall? It shows us how terrifying war is and how dehumanising it can be, the way that it takes away our identities as human beings. Alright, so if you want to get stuck into some slightly higher grades quotes for sort of grade 6 and above, then I've got 2 quotes for you which you can make notes on now. So the first one is the patriotic tear. So this image as a whole, it juxtaposes or it goes directly against the normal connotations of patriotism. So patriotism is supposed to fill you with pride and a kind of positive, fulfilling feeling that you're really fighting for your country and you're doing a positive and honourable thing here. But in this quote, it's with the noun tear. So that directly contrasts or goes against this idea of patriotism. We normally think of tears as when you cry or when you're upset. So in this poem, Hughes is saying that patriotism and fighting for your country actually will only bring you misery, will only bring you sadness and pain and upset, and things that we don't normally associate with patriotism. So what does it show? So this shows that patriotic ideals, this idea of fighting for your country, are actually lost in the horrors of war, and that by being patriotic, you're actually put in a horrifying situation where you become disillusioned with the idea of fighting for your country. You no longer see that it's an important thing. And then this is backed up by the second extension quotes, which is a list here: king, honour, human dignity, etc., dropped like luxuries. So here we've got a list of the things the soldier believes or thinks he should be fighting for. And these things all link very much to the propaganda of war. So this idea that if you went to fight in World War I, you were sort of seen as a hero fighting for your country. But here specifically, Hughes uses the adverb etc. And normally when we say etc, it shows that we don't really care about the rest of the list. So it's quite dismissive, it's quite offhand. These things don't really matter that he's listing, and they've become meaningless for the soldier in this poem. He no longer believes in them. And this is supported by the simile which comes after, dropped like luxuries. So this is the idea that only those who were kind of not really actually fighting on the front line, for example, the higher class generals, can actually afford to believe in this great principle of propaganda of the idea of fighting for your country. A lot of people criticise the generals in World War I for sending the soldiers to their deaths without really understanding what they were doing or their kind of tactics. They were just sort of sending them without really any clear thought for the fact that the soldiers were going to die. And there was lots of criticism about this at the time. So perhaps Hughes, remember he's writing 40 years later, he could be referring to these generals here and their luxuries that they believe in. But for the soldiers who are actually on the front line, fighting in the trenches, this idea of king and country and honour only bring misery and pain. And that's obviously foreshadowed by the tear earlier in the poem, which again shows that he's going to be miserable from the fighting. So overall, what does this show then? Again, it shows us that patriotic ideals are simply lost in the horror of war. Staying alive actually becomes your only concern. rather than thinking that your fighting is honourable. Everything that will just take over will be that human instinct to stay alive and to keep living. All right, so you've got some of the real key quotes from the poem here, and you should have made notes, careful notes on each one. Pause the video, rewind it if you needed to look at bits, and tried to put them in your own notes as well. So hopefully you've got on well with that. So at this point, now that you've got some detailed notes on those quotes, it would be good to try and find some other quotes to back up what we've said. So your task now is to see if you can find any other quotes in the poem which could be used as secondary evidence to prove the points made by the quotes that I've given you so far. So this is a chance to pause and make notes on your poem with some secondary quotes that could support your ideas. So I'll give you an example here. Can you find any other quotes that suggest he doesn't really know what he's doing or why he's there? Can you find any other quotes that show that he doesn't really feel prepared for the battle? And those are ideas that we've already seen in the quotes that I've given you so far. So a chance to pause the video now and see if you can find any linking quotes to make some notes on. Okay, folks, well, if you've got this far, well done. That's the end of today's lesson on Bayonet Charge. So thank you very much for your hard work on this poem. And I will catch you on one of the later videos. For now, hope you're all well, hope you stay safe, and take care.